What is Affinity? 702.40. Well, that seems pretty simple. For one of the most busted mechanics ever printed, buckle up nerds, this one is a doozy. What is Affinity? Before we get into the busted bit, let's just look at the rules. Affinity is always written as Affinity for blank. Blank here could be almost anything, but the most common thing it was when it showed up in the original Mirrodin block was artifacts. So using that as an example, if something has affinity for artifacts, then it costs 1 generic mana less to cast for each artifact you control as you start to cast it. A few more rules notes before we dive into the historical context. You can't net mana from affinity. Sticking with our example, if you control more artifacts than necessary, you are still only reducing the total generic mana needed to cast that spell to 0. Affinity also only reduces generic mana. Mana color symbols would still need to be paid, as well as specifically colorless mana symbols. Affinity doesn't change the total mana value of the spell. And finally, cost reduction is locked as you start casting the spell. If you sacrifice artifacts to pay for the cost once the spell is on the stack, that artifact would still count towards that original affinity calculation. And yeah, Affinity was crazily broken when it came out, so much so that a lot of cards with the ability and that enabled the ability, notably the artifact lands, had to be banned. Affinity could still make a comeback. It has essentially appeared on some one-off cards here and there, just with the ability spelled out rather than printed as Affinity, but likely in a much more restricted form, if ever. And that's what Affinity is.